Okay, fatty fart pants. Fatty fart pants. My God. That's basically the N-word. You shouldn't say that. Anyway, can we get into the actual topic? Yes. Let's talk about a war game. So, for those of you who do not know, a war game is, well, it's a game of war. But it's not like a video game. Well, it's kind of like a video game. A war game is basically a scenario that's run through where you have two sides of a conflict that basically try from their side of the conflict the best they can in order to beat the other side. So you have one set of players on one side, one set of players on the other side, and they got this big complicated game of war where they basically run simulations about who would win this conflict, right? And that's how a lot of times war planners, generals, and governments will plan out conflicts or plan for wars or find out that maybe they shouldn't go to war, is by running these scenarios to find out what a hypothetical war would end up like. This has happened with a lot of conflict. Israel does this all the time when it comes to potential wars with Iran or other countries. The United States runs this all the time. And a lot of our war games are actually secret. And they're secret because we don't want the world to know exactly how it would play out. Because if we have certain weaknesses that are exposed by these war games, we don't want to share with the world exactly what those weaknesses are. Or if we find weaknesses in our opponents, we don't want to tell the world, hey, everybody, this is your weakness. This is what we're going to exploit in a potential war scenario. And so a lot of these are actually secret. But this war game scenario, which was run, was not secret. It was public because it wasn't done by the U.S. government trying to have with secret info. It was done by something that's a lot more public in sharing this information. So we actually have a war game scenario that was run 24 times. So this wasn't just like one game of chess to determine who's better in the specific game of chess. This is by like running a game of chess between two people 24 times. After 24 times, you would have a general idea, considering how many times you've run the simulation, who's the better chess player. And so after 24 times of these people running this war game of exactly who would win in a potential scenario where Taiwan is invaded by China, China loses. China loses, and their navy is left in shambles, and they lose probably, I think the estimate was around over 10,000 soldiers. That this ends in failure for the Chinese government. Now, there's the details that I think are important. So you see that this isn't a zero-sum game of victory and loss. You can see that war all around should be avoided at all costs. And I think this war game kind of highlights that. And also, there's a really important asterisk that is not given on this article headline or any of the articles that is talking about this on the headline. So I think we should talk about it. So let's read some of the article. A Chinese invasion of Taiwan in 2026 would result in thousands of casualties amongst Chinese, the United States, Taiwanese, and Japanese forces. The Japanese forces were included in the scenario as well, as would possibly be the case in a potential matchup. And it would be unlikely to result in a victory for Beijing, according to the prominent independent Washington think tank, which conducted war games simulations of a possible conflict that is preoccupying military and political leaders in Asia and Washington. A war over Taiwan could leave the U.S. military could leave a victorious U.S. military in a crippled state as the Chinese forces it defeated. At the end of the conflict, at least 2 U.S. aircraft carriers would lie at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and China's modern navy, which is the largest in the world, would be in shambles. Now, for context, we have about like 11 or 12 aircraft carriers, and they say at least 2, meaning that at least around 20% of our aircraft carriers sink, and our aircraft carriers are extremely important. They're very important for this American idea of like power projection. The idea that we can basically at a moment's notice deploy jets to do a strike basically anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. It's an extremely powerful ability the United States has. Its doctrine is kind of based in it, and aircraft carriers are the foundation upon which that doctrine is built. And so losing aircraft carriers is very bad for the United States because they're not easy to replace and they're extremely expensive. And that's actually why the Russians and the Chinese have worked so hard to try to master anti-aircraft carrier technology to try to take them out. The Russians always talk about like the supersonic, hypersonic missiles. And the Chinese have also been trying to figure this out, while the United States have been trying to find out better and better ways to protect their aircraft carriers. Those are among the conclusions the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, made after running what it claims is one of the most extensive war game simulations. Again, one of the most extensive war game simulations ever conducted on a possible conflict over Taiwan, the democratically ruled island of 24 million that the Chinese Communist Party claims is part of its sovereign territory despite never having controlled it. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has refused to rule out the use of military force to bring the island under Beijing's control. I think it was like the 20th Party conference. During the speech, he said, "I want to reunify China peacefully if possible, but we do not hold back the use of force. We reserve the use of force when it comes to reunification," which is basically a vague threat saying we will invade Taiwan if necessary to reunify China and Taiwan. It is the goal of our nation to do so, and we are going to do it either peacefully or non-peacefully. That was basically the gist of his statement in the most direct way I could make it. CNN reviewed an advanced copy of the report titled "The First Battle of the Next War" on the 24 war scenarios run by CSIS, which said the project was necessary because previous government and private war simulations had been too narrow or too opaque to give the public and policymakers a true look at how the conflict across the Taiwan Strait may play out. There's no unclassified war game out there looking at the US-China conflict, said Mark Cassian, one of the 3 project leaders and its senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Of the games that are unclassified, they're usually only done once or twice. But CSIS run the game 24 times to answer 2 fundamental questions. Would the invasion succeed, and at what cost? The likely answer to those questions are no and enormous. The United States and Japan lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and thousands of service members. Such losses would damage the U.S. global position for many years, the report said. In most scenarios, the U.S. Navy lost 2 aircraft carriers and 10 to 20 large surface combatants. Approximately 3,200 U.S. troops would be killed in 3 weeks of combat, nearly half of what the U.S. lost in 2 decades of combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. China also suffers heavily. Its navy would be left in shambles. The core of its amphibious forces would be broken, and tens of thousands of soldiers would be prisoners of war, it said. The report estimates China would suffer about 10,000 troops killed and lose 155 combat aircraft and 138 major ships. Major ships. So this isn't like total ships lost by China, but these are like the big boys, not the tiny little like escort ship, but like the big boys, right? Now, we're going to read a little bit more, and then I'm going to give you some conclusions based upon this. Taiwan would be devastated. The scenarios paint a bleak future for Taiwan, even if the Chinese invasion didn't succeed. While Taiwan's military is unbroken, it is severely degraded and left to defend a damaged economy on an island with electricity and basic services. The island's army would suffer about 3,500 casualties, and all 26 destroyers and frigates in the navies will be sunk, the report said. That's not too surprising, considering like China, in order to invade Taiwan, is going to need to have beachheads. And in order to create beachheads, they're going to have to sink the Taiwanese Navy. And speed would be the essence of the Chinese plan, because the longer they take, the more America had time to respond, the more that Taiwan would be able to mobilize its reserves, and the more American naval assets could be deployed and sent over to the Pacific.
Burns is an morally
corrupt, bankrupt man. Kami Pitio, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub to Boy678. I appreciate it. Japan is likely to lose more than 100 combat aircraft and 26 warships, while U.S. military bases on its home's territory come under Chinese attack, the report found. This would be like islands like Guam. So this doesn't mean like New York or something. We're talking about like islands like Guam, right? So islands that are in the Pacific that are full of U.S. citizens, but are technically not U.S. states. These are the areas that are closer to Taiwan, closer to China, and host American military assets that China would want to disable basically immediately to try to stop an American response if they believed America would respond. But the CSIS report said it did not want its report to imply a war over Taiwan, this is very important, is inevitable or even probable. The Chinese leadership might adopt a strategy of diplomatic isolation, gray zone pressure, or economic coercion against Taiwan. So, this is something that they get into a little bit here. We can kind of skip it. But I do want to say that China, if they can, wants to make Taiwan submit using cultural power, economic power, and diplomatic power. If they can, they want to avoid a war. The reasons they want to avoid a war is A, there's a decent chance, as this report's talking about, that they would not even win. In fact, I would say right now, a pretty likely chance. They don't want to go to war with the United States, which is a nation that has nukes. They don't want that. They don't want to basically risk nuclear confrontation, which has been a hot button issue over Ukraine, for example. They don't want to also fight Japan. It would be extremely economically damaging to Taiwan because they actually trade quite a lot with Taiwan, which not only gives them more influence when it comes to, you know, trying to economically coerce them to serve their interests, but also means that they would lose all that trade. But they wouldn't only lose that trade with Taiwan, they would likely also lose it with Japan, and who is a big trader with them. I mean, trillions of dollars of trade is done. The United States, one of their biggest, if not their biggest market in the world, which they would not want to lose and would be really, really damaging to the Chinese economy. Not even talking about the diplomatic view that the world would have to this, where they would see this as, you know, bad. They wouldn't like this very much, especially in the fallout of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when the world's trying to recover economically from a destructive war. And so China, if it can, wants to avoid a war. One, because they don't want to lose a war. Two, wars are damaging to the military, and they don't want their navy to, you know, be in shambles. And three, they don't want the economic and diplomatic repercussions of launching a war. So if they can avoid it, they will. A lot of people kind of do the whole doomsday. The end is near, the end is near, the end is near. The Chinese are going to invade Taiwan, and they're going to take it in seconds, and it's all going to be over, and then the world's going to blow up. That scenario, as of right now, is still frankly unlikely. Not that it can't happen. The diplomatic situation, of course, can change in the future. But if the Chinese can avoid it, they will. But Pentagon leaders have labeled China as America's pacing threat. And last year's China's military power report, mandated by Congress, said the PLA increased provocative and destabilizing actions in and around Taiwan Strait, to include increased flights into Taiwan's claimed air defense identification zone and conducting exercises focused on the potential seizure of one of Taiwan's outlying islands. For those of you who do not know this, I guess this is important. If you were to look at Taiwan and go to this map here, Taiwan isn't just this. They've also got little islands on the coastline with China that would be a lot easier for China to take. And I mean like right along the coastline, right? This would be a lot easier for China to take. In a potential war scenario, these would probably fall quite quickly, and I don't see a scenario where the Chinese don't end up capturing them. I mean, the Taiwanese can make it very painful for them. They could try to decentivize it by making these places death traps, but the Taiwanese will also be thinking about, like, how much do we really want to spend on, you know, trying to stop the capture of these islands, when also, you know, we could have those resources on the home island and make it stronger. Let's keep going. In August, the visit of then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the island prompted a wide-ranging display of PLA military might, which included sending missiles over the island as well as into the waters of Japan's economic exclusive zone. There was even talk on certain like Chinese state media about like shooting down the plane. It was like commentators, basically. And I said at the time, number one, this is not an official government statement. This is state media, which, I mean, is bad, but the government is not saying they will do this, and they're not going to do it for all the reasons I've already laid out. Not to mention, doing that would guarantee that it would be a war with the United States as well, which if they were to fight a war with Taiwan, they would hope that the strategic ambiguity that the United States holds with Taiwan, which is basically the position that the United States has, which says like, hey, maybe we will defend them, maybe we won't. Who knows? Who knows? And we say that in order to not change the status quo of the situation, which gives people a certain amount of stability. And so if they can avoid that, they will avoid that. Not to mention the diplomatic norms they would be violating. Oh my God, it would have been a disaster. So that was always why I wasn't that concerned about the Nancy Pelosi trip, outside of basically, and what I said at the time, which ended up being true, was we were most likely just going to get military drills after, and missile launches, which is what we got. Not that surprising. So this goes on for a bit, and I just want to quickly say that there's two disclaimers I need to put here. The first disclaimer is, again, that an invasion is not even necessarily likely. Again, the most likely scenario is that an invasion never happens. Not that it won't, or that we shouldn't do our best to disincentivize it, but that most likely it doesn't happen. That's the first disclaimer. And so the scenario isn't saying like when the war happens, it's saying if it happens. Second disclaimer, and this is very important. In fact, this is the most important disclaimer. This scenario is played out in a hypothetical 2026, 3 years from now. And I would assume most military planners would agree that China would probably not launch an invasion if they were building up to one in 2026, considering they're still increasing the amount of funding they're giving to their military and to their navy as they're trying to build more ships. The Chinese government is actively trying to build up their military strength so that this equation, which currently says, according to these war games, that an invasion right now would not succeed, they're trying to build up to a future date way past 2026, this is my opinion, where they could make that a more realistic pressure that is more likely to succeed than not, which is not currently the scenario as laid out by this war game and by many other military analysts. This is not the first military analyst or institution to come out and say that China probably wouldn't succeed if they invaded right now. Now, this is a proposed 3 years from now, so they still would have 3 more years to prepare than what they currently have, but it still ends in failure. So don't think that if a proposed invasion was to happen in, say, 2040, that this would end with the same result, the same casualties, the same anything. Hell, even a lot of times these war games can't predict every action that even happens in the first place, but certainly the China and America and Taiwan that we see and Japan that we see in 2026 is probably going to be different than the one we see in 2024. So don't think that this is basically a statement from them saying, hey, China doesn't got a chance, Taiwan's safe. It's just, hey, if China was to try to do this in the next 3 years, they probably fail. Not next 15, next 20, next 30, which that is still an open question in the air. And whether or not that succeeds depends on a whole host of factors. Now, this report actually talks about the 4 constants in all of these winning scenarios when it comes to this happening in 2026. So let's talk about those 4 constants before talking about the things that the United States needs to have in order for long term it to be more stable, be more structured. It's not a complete list, but what this study talked about. Here were the 4 constants in the winning scenarios in this war game that where America, won, USA, hoorah, Taiwan forever. Number 1, Taiwan's ground forces must be able to contain the Chinese beachheads. That means when China lands on the shore, they need to be able to contain them. During D-Day, when American soldiers were landing in Normandy and the German troops were trying to fire at them and stop them, this would be if the Germans had a faster response and were able to contain us on the beachhead. That's what the Taiwanese need to do. They would need to stop the landing from expanding and leading to the capture of cities and supply depots and places where China could fortify their positions more and bring in more soldiers. soldiers, because if they only have a beachhead, then the beachhead's going to be crowded with Chinese soldiers. We can be taken out by Taiwanese and American artillery, small arms fire, rocket strikes, you name it, and they can't get deeper into the country. So that's the first thing that needs to happen. They need to stop the beachheads before they develop into like larger landings. The U.S. must be able to use as bases in Japan for combat operations. This means that for a winning scenario, the United States cannot defend Taiwan alone. And this is something I've talked about before. We need to work with our allies in the region, including Japan. I would say South Korea would be another person you could point at. Australia, all the other countries in the region are going to have to work with the United States to develop long-term plans to get involved in a scenario like this, to act not only as a disincentive, but also in this supposed scenario to help Taiwan. And so Japan must be involved if this for these winning scenarios to take place, it seems. Maybe that must be, but the odds are greatly increased in America's favor when we're able to use those bases. That doesn't necessarily even mean Japan themselves are sending combat aircraft, which in this scenario they ran it like that, but at the very least be able to use those bases in Japan, which, I mean, why else would we have them if not to use them in a scenario like this? Anyway, next one. The U.S. must have long-range anti-ship missiles to hit the PLA Navy from afar and en masse. That means as the landings are happening, as they're trying to develop the beachhead, we're taking out the ships that are transporting troops, and we're taking out the ships that are allowing the Chinese to have dominance over the waves, especially since China is building up, probably more than anything else, their fleet. They are really trying to increase the amount of ships they have so that they can basically Zerg rush. I don't know if any of you guys play that old I forget what the game's called, but like they're like rush it like with these ships. And so they need to be able, the United States that is, to disable those ships with long range anti-ship missiles. Starcraft, thank you so much. It was Starcraft. Here's the next one and the final one. And the US needs to fully, and this is a big one, fully arm Taiwan before the shooting starts and jumps into any conflict with its own forces immediately. Immediately is what the war game says. Not tomorrow, not the next day, but immediately. This is the reason why. The reason why is that, let's say a war happens. The first thing the Chinese are going to do is try to blockade Taiwan, stop any ships from getting in, and disable the Taiwanese Navy. Once that happens, American aid is going to be extremely difficult to get in, if not impossible. And so this can't be like it was with Ukraine, where, oh, we see that Taiwan has a fighting chance and now we're sympathetic to them and their young democracy. And so now we are going to go into Congress and we're going to ask if we can send aid, and then we send aid. But by the time we do that, the nation's already blockaded. Like, there's a decent chance we can't even get the aid in. And so what this scenario plays out is America needs to get the aid in now so that when this scenario happens in the future, if it does, not when, but if it does, they would already have the weapons necessary to defend themselves, and they wouldn't be basically wishing and hoping that they had sent the aid sooner, with basically the Taiwanese not having enough equipment to defend themselves and us having no routes to get it into the country. And so that's why you're seeing escalations in aid, quote unquote. We're going to call it escalations, even though in my mind it's just following, that's what Hassan called it, even though in my mind it's just following the Taiwan's Relations Act, which we passed in 1979, which it's kind of hard to be an escalation when it's been the law for about 50 fucking years, over 50 years. But we need to send more aid to Taiwan, and we need to sell them most of the weapons, if not all the weapons that they're requesting. Because we need to be able to guarantee their ability to defend themselves. And some people might say, like, oh my gosh, but if we send them weapons, maybe China will invade. We know that there's a decent chance that if China invades, that they fail right now. And so the idea that us sending them the aid so that it's likely that they fail in the future, or us selling more weapons to them so it's likely that they fail in the future, it wouldn't make sense for them to launch it now unless they were just completely like, we're never going to have the cards in our favor, so we need to do it now, even if it's unlikely, as shown by this war game scenario, which was run 24 times. And so that's why I'm a big proponent of supporting Taiwan, just like we're supporting Ukraine. Not in the same fashion, i.e. we're supporting Ukraine after the fact, because we won't have that opportunity, most likely, with Taiwan. Now, here are some other things that it talks about that the United States can do to prepare itself for potential scenario. This includes fortifying U.S. bases in Japan and Guam against Chinese missile attacks, because these are going to need to be, locations that America can use against the Chinese Navy and to support Taiwan and launching aircraft and stuff like that. The United States needs to move its naval forces to smaller and more survivable ships. They need to prioritize submarines. They need to prioritize sustainable bomber forces over fighter forces, so big bomber aircraft. We need to produce more cheaper fighters, and we need to push Taiwan towards a similar strategy, which arms itself with more simple weapons platforms rather than the expensive ships that are unlikely to survive a Chinese first strike. Now, you don't need to agree with all of that. I don't even know if necessarily I agree with all of that. I'm not a military expert, mind you. But that's what the war game lays out as things that the United States and Taiwan need to do to prepare for this potential scenario where there's a decent chance that even American soil, like Guam, would actually be under threat. And so these are the things that it proposes that we do. So I just want to say quickly that Taiwan is a young, fragile democracy that fought very, very, very hard to have it against its military dictatorship, which went down from Chiang Kai-shek to his son. They fought very hard and bled for it. And they had an opportunity to say, you know what, we don't want democracy, when that system started to collapse with Chiang Kai-shek. But they didn't, because the people were fighting for democracy, and that's what they got. And now the Taiwanese are very protective of it. As we see from young Taiwanese, they're more and more developing this idea of Taiwanese identity based around freedom of expression, based around civil liberties, based around these things, which they hold dear, which has helped garner them a higher standard of living than what is currently available in mainland China, when it comes to like an average standard of living for the average Taiwanese person. It's also led to them having certain civil liberties that the people on mainland China don't have. And when we see the Chinese government offer them this idea of like one country, two systems, I mean, anybody who's been following, been a China watcher, quote unquote, I hate that term, but China watcher long term, saw what happened with Hong Kong when it came to one country, two systems. The Chinese quickly went back on that idea of one country, two systems, and started to arrest people for booing the Chinese national anthem and taking away the civil liberties that these people wanted to cherish and went onto the streets to protest for. And that was what China was offering Taiwan. They said to the Taiwanese, hey, be like Hong Kong, one country, two systems. And you can see the support for reunification with China, which was already low. Reunification with China under Beijing government. It even went down further because they saw what happened in Hong Kong and said, we don't want that for us. Because the Taiwanese had a large amount of sympathy for the people in Hong Kong. They felt a lot of personal connection with them for obvious reasons. And so I believe on a moral level, even just completely avoiding the strategic stuff that you're going to hear people like Josh Hawley and others talk about endlessly when it comes to the massive amount of chip manufacturing that goes on in Taiwan that is important for weapon systems and computers and economies around the world and all that, or its strategic base in the Indo-Pacific. Putting all that aside, there is a strong moral case, definitely as how we're based in the United States, where I don't even want to say we have similar foundations when it comes to the founding of our nations, but similar principles and probably like somewhat similar origins when it comes to the idea of like settler colonialism and the development of representative democracy from a authoritarian system, breaking off of that. I believe there is a strong moral case for supporting Taiwan, and I think that we should support them. I am a very big supporter of Taiwan, and I was a supporter of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And for the reasons this war game lays out, the idea that was going to spark a war was extremely unlikely. And we should not ever have set the standard, which we didn't, thank goodness, that American Congress people of their own free will aren't able to go to Taiwan and develop their ties with local Taiwanese politicians or the government or anything. I want our Congress, I want our Senate actively involved in foreign policy. I don't think the executive branch should just run amok and be completely in charge of foreign policy to the end of all days. I think our Congress needs to assert itself when it comes to its foreign policy. And so I was a big supporter of that. And I think we need to deepen our ties with Taiwan economically, so when the economic coercion possibly does come in the future, they have a cushion to fall back upon. And we need to support them strategically and work with allies in the region so that this scenario, not only if this scenario was to play out, that Taiwan would retain its sovereignty, its freedom, its democracy, these things, but also to hopefully avoid the war altogether. To hopefully build such a disincentive as the Chinese, if they were to look at this report and this was to be true, they would not launch it because they would not want to devastate their navy. They would not want to lose all these soldiers. They would not want to be humiliated. Hopefully we can disincentivize the war altogether. Peace through strength, I think, is usually how it's put in the most practical sense. Anyway, this war game scenario gave me hope in Taiwan's defense. But don't let it give you false hope that now we can all just kind of like put our hands behind our heads and be like, la-di-da-di-da-di-da, everything's fine now. This was played out in 2026, not 2030, not 2035, not 2040, not 2050. If necessary, the Chinese government will play the long game. And so we should as well.